Could you please welcome the Right Honourable Peter Lilley.
Thank you very much indeed. It's a great privilege to follow my two distinguished predecessors on this platform. And I hate to begin by picking a quarrel with Norman Tebbit. It's understandable that he, as a resident of Bury St Edmunds, may feel that we should reinstate the King Edward the Confessor as our patron saint, but I, as someone who is elected as a Member of Parliament for St Albans, would like to put forward the claim of St Alban, our first saint, who was executed under the Roman Empire for showing a degree of independence of thought. I hope I'll be excused if I reminisce a little in order to learn some lessons from the past to apply to the present and future. My approach to Europe has been always somewhat different from that of many people in this room. The first speech I ever gave as a child, at the time, the negotiations of the European that led to the setting up of the European community were taking place, was to advocate that we took part and joined this embryonic group. There's sadly no record exists of this, or perhaps fortunately no record exists of this speech. The first pamphlet I ever wrote with a group of friends from Cambridge was called A Europe of Nations, saying yes, we should join, but we should make sure that it was a fundamentally economic group as far as we were concerned, and we would retain our right to govern ourselves within it. More significant, perhaps, was the first referendum in 1975, which I'm old enough to remember, all you are too young. But I had read the Treaty of Rome and had some reservations about whether we should sign up to it. It seemed to me to lead to much more than a common market, which I broadly wanted, and have political implications. But I was persuaded, nonetheless, to put those reservations aside, first by my elders and betters, who told me that broadly our partners in Europe had agreed to set aside those political ambitions in return for having us as members of the common market. But perhaps more significant, I was persuaded to join the Keep Britain in Europe movement at the time by an extremely pretty girl who I subsequently married. So I've done very well out of Europe, and me and the farmers, basically. My first job as economic secretary, I was actually out representing this country at the meeting of Commonwealth finance ministers in Cyprus. The day of the Bruges speech, I had no prior warning of it, and the meeting of all the finance ministers from all the Commonwealth countries was in consternation. All the headlines were about this. They wanted to know what it was about. I rapidly read the speech and said, well, it should be very familiar to you. You've all gained your independence over the last few decades. This is about Britain regaining its right to make its own laws. And they thought, oh, that seems quite a good idea. My first cabinet post was as Secretary of State for Trade and Industry, where I was responsible for implementing the programme for the single market. And as always, I was in favour of a single market in Europe, of maximum opportunity for our countries to trade and invest across Europe, and did so with enthusiasm. But because my other reservations about Europe were well known, for some reason, the Prime Minister had cast doubts on my paternity, I wanted to make a speech emphasising the positive aspects. So I got my officials after 1992, which was the great date of the implementation of the single market, to draw up a speech showing what British companies were now able to do and doing that they had not been able to do prior to the implementation of the single market. And they came up with lots of examples of what British companies were doing which they hadn't been doing before. But not a single example of what British companies are doing which they hadn't been able to do before. And I suddenly realised that actually the single market wasn't just about removing barriers. It had done remarkably little of that. It was about creating a single regulatory zone. And we should remember that and perhaps not refer so much to the single market as the single regulatory zone, which is not something we are necessarily entirely in favour of. My first shadow post was, as Barry reminded us, as Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer. And I had to oppose, although we were somewhat equivocal about it, oppose our membership of the euro. The government was still actively trying to change the climate of opinion so that we could join the euro when it started. I always used to use one story which has turned out to be prophetic when arguing against this. I would recount an incident which took place in Brussels where a journalist friend of mine was over there. He woke up in the morning, found he'd forgotten his razor. He went down to the reception desk and said, could you sell me or lend me a razor? I haven't got mine with me. And they said, no, I'm afraid we can't. We're not allowed to sell razors, but we have got a shaving machine. He said, see that booth over there, a bit like one of those photo booths? You go in there, you put your head through the hole, you put in a coin, you press the button, and it shaves you. And he said, but that's terrifying. He said, surely everybody's got a different sized head and a different shaped head. Oh, yes, they said, but only the first time. And I said, that is what membership of the euro would be like. It would be shaving into shape. Different economies of different stages, different kinds, different economic cycles to one, and it would be extremely painful. And sadly, the people of Greece are now discovering that in spades. Now, the lessons I learned during this career are, first of all, that there is a European project. I've never actually heard a speech by any of my colleagues in this country who support our membership referring to the European project, spelling out what it is, or advocating that we take part in it. But on the continent, it is part of everyday discourse. I've heard it mentioned in sermons, and I have a house over in France when I go to church. There, it's mentioned from time to time in sermons as something benign that we all know and we all sign up to. That project is not primarily economic. It's indeed a political union, ultimately, which has an economic cost, but nonetheless we're prepared to bear that cost to create that political union. Underlying it, the third point, is it's an ideology. It replaces for the elites in Europe the ideology of socialism, which was discredited and to some extent destroyed by the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, but which formerly was the dominant ideology in Europe. So to replace that ideology of international socialism by supranational statism. Instead of trying to build socialism in one country, you're building a supranational state across the whole of Europe. And just as one of the motivations for socialism was anti-American, part of the motivation of this European project, ideology, is anti-American. And the symptom of an ideology is always that if it fails, that's proof you need more of it. That was a feature of socialism. If socialism didn't work, that means we needed higher taxes, more controls, more regulation, more state ownership. And so it is with the European project. Any problem is a cause for more Europe. And there are, I forget which particular European commissioner said who said, no crisis should be ever allowed to go to waste. And any crisis will be used for more centralisation of powers in accordance with their ideology. But the fourth point is, it's not a revolutionary ideology, it's a Fabian ideology. The Fabian society in this country was set up using the example of Fabius Cunca, or whatever he was, the Roman general, who said always proceed step by step, and so on. Europe is being created by a series of steps. We've lost powers unnecessarily, powers way beyond what are necessary to run a common trading area, in a series of salami slices. And we should remember that. I'll come back to that. Like socialism, the ideology of the European project is fundamentally anti-democratic. It is based on the belief that the people are suffering from false consciousness, they have this absurd affection for their countries, for their own institutions, their own way of doing things, and that has got to be overcome, and it's got to be overcome so that one day they'll wake up and find that all those things to which they're attached have disappeared. It has its specific doctrines, two of which are not in any of the treaties, but are broadly accepted across the European community. The first is the doctrine of the acquis communautaire, the belief that once powers have been transferred from member states to the European institutions, they can never be returned. And I was looking up the history of this, and the first example I can find of it actually being articulated was actually at the time of Britain's application for membership, when it was specifically enunciated, and we were required, the British government was then required to adhere to it, because they wanted to be sure that Britain would not lead to the unravelling of any of the centralisation of powers that had taken place up to that point. It's an odd doctrine, because we take it as quite natural within the United Kingdom that we should argue for or against more devolution from Whitehall to Edinburgh, for example, or Cardiff, or Belfast, or within that to individual northern powerhouse and so on. But in Europe, the doctrine is that powers can't go back. Even the so-called doctrine of subsidiarity, when it was formulated at a council meeting, preceded that by saying, without any suggestion the existing acquis should be undone, we believe that power should be exercised at the lowest level within the European institutions, the closest to the people as possible. So even that is subordinated to the doctrine of the acquis communautaire. And the second doctrine is that countries can move at different speeds, but only have one direction. That, the Brits are a bit slow at coming on board the euro, they can exist for a while, and other countries, particularly new members, can be slow about implementing bits of the acquis. But in the long term, everybody's moving in the same direction. And sometimes that's misinterpreted, that because there are different speeds, there can be different directions. That has never been accepted on the continent, though people, either through misunderstanding or a desire to dupe us, have often suggested we can have what they called a multi-geometry Europe. That is not accepted on the continent. We've recently had it restated. Britain cannot adopt a la carte. We must accept the set menu. And we need to be aware of that. Now, what are the implications for that for the current renegotiation? And I, possibly out of tune with many people in this hall, would like to see a sensible renegotiation that makes it possible for us to stay within the broad framework of a European Union. Well, first of all, we have to recognise that the Eurozone states are now on a conveyor belt to creating fairly rapidly a single political union, a single government, a single state, the United States of the Eurozone. I don't know whether I can get it up quickly, but there was a speech given in London just recently by Mr. Draghi, I think it was last week, who said, talking about financial markets and the single market, said for the market to be truly free, there needs to exist a judiciary power that can enforce the rule of law on all, everywhere. It has to have jurisdiction across the entire market. A judiciary power implements the law, so there must then exist a legislative power that writes the laws that govern the market in the first place. And in turn, if there exists a legislative and a judiciary, and if they are to have any effect, there must exist an executive power to enforce their decisions. What this shows is that a true market, one that is both open and free, requires the existence of, at the level of the whole market, the three branches of government: that makes it an eminently political construct. And as far as the Eurozone is concerned, he's right. There's never been a currency in the history of the world without a government and a state to run it, equipped with powers to spend and borrow and tax and regulate and transfer money from poor as rich as poor, and so on. And the Eurozone countries know that they have created an unstable equilibrium or a disequilibrium by creating a currency without those powers, and they're going to move progressively to create the political union necessary to make their currency viable. We ideally would like a relationship with that embryonic state that does not include us as members of it. No party in this country openly advocates it, though some people clearly privately would actually want us to be part of it. But most people in this country and most practicing politicians who want to win any votes would say we want a relationship with the Eurozone countries, which is more like that of Canada within the North American Free Trade Area than that of California within the United States of America, or probably rather less prosperous than California. Now, we can, in principle, either renegotiate our relationship with the Eurozone countries from within, which might be less frightening to the horses, but that's actually more difficult because you're then moving against these doctrines that are embedded in the whole thing, or you can do it from without, which is simpler, but will be perceived by people as more disruptive, leaving you a period not knowing quite what the relationship will be. My view is that we lost our powers within Europe in a series of salami slices. It's inconceivable we can get back all the powers we like in one go. I am quite modest in my demands, and I've written to the Prime Minister some years ago saying we should accept that fact. In any honest negotiation should accept we're not going to get everything we want in one go. What we must do, however, in the first go, is break the doctrines of the acquis communautaire, show that, at least in Britain's case, powers can come back from the institution to us, and that we are not committed to going in the same direction, a single direction in which the other countries are going. If we could do that, that would actually go a long way to encouraging me. I'd settle for modest gains now and a recognition that every time there's a treaty that they'll need to create this super-state, we will demand more powers back as a quid pro quo for the giving more. If we can't, however, get that initial breach with the breakthrough of those two doctrines, the doctrine of the acquis communautaire and the single direction commitment, then I will be very worried indeed, and I think it will be the only clear, practical way to develop a proper relationship would be to leave. The danger is that we negotiate something which doesn't create that precedent for getting powers back, but is presented as a full and final settlement. It's a danger in two ways. Firstly, if we did then persuade people we ought to stay in because we got a nice new relationship with the rest of Europe, and it turned out to be insubstantial, and we were still on the conveyor belt, along with everybody else, perhaps at a slower speed, but in that same direction. If we still face that ratchet, the powers could only ever go to Europe and never come back, then that would lead the Europhiles to say, the old arguments they always use, oh, the only way we can ever have influence is to go along with the project. It's always seemed to me an absurd argument to say that the only way we can defeat the project is to embrace it, but that's broadly what they say. It would also lead to immense disillusion in the British people when they discover, or if they were to discover, that they were sold a pup. What we've got to do is either negotiate something that is substantive and does mean that we are on the direction of becoming Canada within a North American Free Trade Area, or to convince the British people of the reality that it's not a choice between a status quo and an uncertain life outside, but between a very uncertain situation inside, where we would still be on an escalator that is leading to a very frightening destination for the people of this country. It's not a choice between a status quo and an uncertainty, but between two uncertainties, and in that case, the relative uncertainty of returning to where 150 other states in the world are, of having power over your own laws, holding your own people to account for making those laws, kicking them out if you don't like them, is not so frightening as going further and deeper into a state where ultimately we don't make our own laws, through our own institutions, hold our own people to account, kick them in the backside if we don't like them, make them change them if we find that they don't work. So, a somewhat ambivalent message from me, but you can see the way we may have to go if this negotiation doesn't achieve something substantive. Thank you.